Welcome back to another episode of The Wizard's Journey. I'm your host, Todd Solon, and thanks for joining me. In the previous episode, we created a very basic website using just HTML, but something very, very important was missing. Color. Our website is very plain and boring, and, well, there's a very specific tool invented for just this purpose. It's called CSS, Cascading Style Sheets, used to create style and appearance for a website. But really, we're going to get into the term cascading later on, so for now, let's take a look at the word style, which is really what this is all about. We can bring style to our website using 3 different methods. The first method is something known as the style attribute. The style attribute allows us to control the appearance of a single element, and we'll get into the details later, but let's just get through the 3 different ways in which we can apply styles to our website. The second method is called the style tag, and this allows us to control the appearance of an entire page, which might sound really good at this point, but there's actually another third option which is even better. The third option, which is known as an external style sheet, would allow us to create a separate file defining the appearance of our entire site. Now, we're going to get a chance to use all 3 of these methods as we go along, but we're going to start off with an external style sheet, since that is technically the best way to do it if the scenario allows. Let's jump right in and get our hands dirty. The first thing we want to do is get our text editor open if you don't already have it open. You can get started with the lesson files from the previous video or from downloading the files on the location on your screen right now. The first thing you're going to want to do is go into the head tag of the page that you just opened. Into the head tags, add the following code, which essentially just attaches a file called style.css. This will be our external style sheet when we create it. In the next step, we're actually going to go create this file, which really isn't complicated. It's the same exact premise of building an HTML file. We simply go and create a new file and save it with the name style.css. If you plan to be using non-Latin symbols in your style sheet, which might potentially happen down the road, you might want to include this at the top of your style sheet if your editor doesn't already add it. Now, the first thing we want to address are the links. You can see that all of them appear as a single color, and that is perfectly fine, but what if we needed to mix it up a little bit? What if we wanted to have different links in different places? So how exactly would we go about accomplishing that? Well, we saw that there were 3 different ways to use CSS, but they all have one thing in common. They all need to change existing HTML elements. So how do we do it exactly? Well, what we're going to create is something called a CSS rule. It's called a rule because in CSS, we call the shots. That means if we want to hereby declare that all links are red, we can do exactly that. So start by typing this code into your style.css file that you've just created. What this code does is it's referring to every link in our document. What exactly does that mean? Well, the A is referring to A tags, which we may call links, but CSS refers to them by what their name is. The curly brackets are going to be used in just a second. This is known as the selector, and it determines which elements are affected by this CSS rule. So we're saying that we're trying to affect every A tag, but that's not enough information, is it? We also need to say what we want to change. This will be known as a property. So add this code inside of those curly brackets, and what this does is it changes the color property of your links to have a value of red. So therefore, the whole CSS rule says all links are red. Before you test this, you're going to need to make sure that both of your files are saved, since you've made changes to both style.css and your other HTML file. Once you've saved both of them, open that file in your web browser and notice that the color of your link should have changed to red. If they haven't changed color, check the completed files in the lessons attached. The next thing we might want to do is make it so the links in the navigation look different than the links in our paragraphs. And we can't accomplish that based on what we've already learned. So the next thing we're going to need to learn how to do is affect elements based on where they appear. This is known as a contextual selector. And the idea is that you're selecting an element based on the context in which it appears, or where it appears in the page. Here's an example of that. If we wanted to affect all the links in our navigation, we can simply write the following inside of style.css underneath the curly brackets of the previous rule. This rule simply states that we want to affect every A tag, but we're stipulating that those A tags have to exist inside of a nav tag. So the rule is for the A tags, but they have to exist inside nav. Go ahead and change the color of those links to be green, and that should create a difference between the links in your paragraphs versus the links in your navigation. Altogether, this CSS rule says that all links in your navigation will be green. Save up all your files, reload it in your browser, and you should see just that. Now, while this is very helpful and necessary for our purposes, we still need to consider the other links in our page. What if we wanted to change this link, or that link, or that link? How do we do it? Well, there's a very simple answer. There are lots of different ways to do it in CSS. We're going to start off simple though. In a future video, I'm going to cover some of the other methods, but for now, let's look at the two most common ways to affect single elements or a group of elements. The first method is called an ID. And an ID selector, which you can see here is preceded by a hashtag, selects a single element in the page, which is really handy if we needed to create a logo or a sidebar or different parts of our navigation. But there are many scenarios where we need to affect multiple elements. And for this purpose, we can use the class selector, which selects one or more different elements having a certain class. You can see that it's preceded by a dot, and this selector will affect multiple elements potentially. Another way to think of this is that the ID is simply the name of the element, whereas a class is almost like what type of element it is. It could be recurring multiple times throughout your page. So the question still remains, how exactly does an element get a certain ID or a certain class? Well, this is something that needs to be accomplished in your HTML code. So go ahead and return back to your HTML file and add the class selected to a link in your navigation. This is going to be used in the next step. Once you've added the class to this link, go back into your style sheet and create a new rule for elements having the class selected. This is accomplished by writing the word selected preceded by a dot. Once you've got that code in place, save your file, reload it in your browser, and you should see that the first link in your navigation has changed to blue. This gives you a pretty good understanding of how CSS works. But before we go, let's look at a couple of other things that we can do to make our site look even better. The first thing we want to do is get rid of the underlines in the links in our navigation. Accomplish this by simply adding text-decoration none inside of your CSS rule for links in the navigation. Once you save and reload your page, you should see that the underlines have disappeared. But there's still a few more things we can do. For instance, what if we wanted to change the background color for those links? Well, luckily CSS has a handy tool for that called background color. This is relatively straightforward up until this crazy text at the very end of the line. This is simply known as a hex color, and without getting into too much detail, a hex color simply defines how much red, how much green, and how much blue is in a specific color. Now, all of this translates into normal decimal numbers like we're used to seeing, but this was used in the past to create a bigger range of numbers with a smaller number of characters. This is much less important nowadays, but go ahead and save it and test it in your browser to see that you should have a background color showing up behind your links. You might be wondering, how exactly am I supposed to figure out what hex code to use for a specific color? Well, it's important to note that almost every program that deals with colors, including the web browsers themselves, have color pickers built in, which will typically give you a hex code. But you should also be aware of the fact that there are other color formats that you can use with CSS. I'm going to cover these in more detail in a future video, but there's going to be more information below this video right now. Oh, there's just one more thing before we call it a day. Does it feel a little crowded in here? If you take a look at our links, they're pretty close to the background color behind them. We're going to talk about this in more detail later on, but you can use a CSS property called padding, which will add space inside of any HTML element. In this case, you'll notice the value doesn't just say 3, but it also includes a unit of measure. This is actually one of the most versatile parts of CSS. CSS supports a wide range of units of measurement, from fixed units like pixels and centimeters, to relative units like ems, which are based off the font size, or VW and VH, which are based off the browser window size. You can even use percentages, which can be a little bit tricky, but we're going to talk a lot more about that in later videos. For now, save up your files, test it, reload it, and rejoice with the fact that now your links have plenty of breathing room. Thank you for joining me and have a wonderful day.